So, a little bit about the Husks' backstory. And there is more to our backstory than what I'm about to share. But I'm just going to, at the minute, I'm just going to share what I knew up until very, very recently. So let's just say, I've known her for, obviously I've known the Husk for 33 years, same as the Beacon. So let's just say what I knew about her pretty much early on, and then, nothing, I didn't learn anything new for 30 years. It's only in the last 3 years where I've learned new background information on her. So I'm just going to share what I knew at the time, before everything went chaotic. So, as you know, she went through a divorce when her children were 6 and 4. If you believe her story, her husband left her for another woman, and then she went through a second marriage, which wasn't the most harmonious, shall we say. Lots of bickering in the house, and you never got the impression that the Husk and her husband, new husband, you never got the impression that they really had a loving, caring relationship. It always seemed like a marriage of convenience. That was evident from day one. I would go over to the Beacon's house when I first met her, and her mother, the Husk, would be sitting in one room watching the television, and her husband, stepdad, would be sitting in another. And it's also important to mention that I found out, I can't remember how long it was until the Beacon told us this, but it was fairly early in the relationship. When I say fairly early, you've got to remember we've been together for 33 years, so fairly early to me is in the first 5 years. Some people, that's a long-term relationship, 5 years, but not to me. That's the early stages. So anyway, the Beacon told me about, there was a previous child that had been born. The firstborn wasn't the Beacon. The firstborn was another, different child, girl, who died after 2 weeks. And I can't remember what the condition was that she died of. The important bits are, the condition wasn't known until they were born, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. It was nobody's fault. Certainly wasn't the Husk's fault, by all accounts. And this, and when this first baby girl died, they were going to call her, obviously I'm not going to use the real names, so let's just put it this way. They were going to call the first child the Beacon, but when she died, they obviously wanted to call the next child the Beacon. I think this is strange. They wanted to call the next child the Beacon. So when they had a little funeral for the first child, they called her something else. I don't know, Elizabeth, whatever, it doesn't really matter. So they had the funeral for the first child as Elizabeth, so they could reserve the name the Beacon for the next child. Ooh. Hiya. You all right? I'm just on the phone, so forgive us if I don't... You all right?
Yes, thank you.
So, I'll go down the water for a bit. So they had the funeral in you know, the little, I don't know, little gravestone or little plaque, whatever, I don't know. I don't know the full details of this. It's not something that gets spoken about in too much detail, which has become, it'll become obvious why soon. So anyway, I think it's a bit strange. I think if you carry it, obviously I'm not a woman, and obviously I wasn't there and I didn't have a say, and I have to be sensitive, but I think it's strange if you carry a baby and you've chosen a name. I know what that's like in terms of from a father's point of view, because the Beacon carried a baby obviously for 9 months, and we had 2 names chosen, boy or girl. And then, you know, if that had happened to me, we would have, you know, we would have seen her off with her given name. I'm really struggling to get my head around why they did this. But and it's a bit weird, because now the Beacon is carrying the name of the first child who sadly died. And I'm thinking, that's a lot of responsibility to live up. And this might sound petty or far-fetched, but you're having to live up to the expectations of a child who didn't live, and therefore you never, you know, that child is perfect in the eyes of the parents. Because how can that child be anything other than perfect? And then when you give that name to the next child, right, go on, fill your boots. That's the benchmark, perfection. Psychologically, that's what I'm going to take from that. And maybe subconsciously the Beacon has taken on that mantle, so to speak, or those expectations, because I don't like the word perfectionist. She's not a perfectionist, but she certainly does want to be the person who glues everybody together and who keeps everything on an even keel in a family. You know, she took on the role of the father figure. I'm the daddy now. I think there could be something in that, subconsciously, psychologically. And I just think that's weird, strange decision. But as this story continues, you'll start to learn that everything in this story is just strange and weird. So, where were we? Right, so the husk unfortunately had a firstborn that died after 2 weeks. Trauma. Can't imagine what that would be like. And obviously, especially for a woman. And a young woman, I don't know how old she was. I haven't worked it out. Let's very quickly try and work it out. I want to say 25. Right at the end of her sort of mental development. It takes on average 25 years for your brain to fully develop or to finish developing. So this trauma could have happened while she's still developing as a young woman. So 25 years old. It could have only been within 3 years, I think. Then the second Beacon came along, i.e. the main Beacon of this story. So 3 years later she came along. So it could have only been 2 years. Obviously I'm just very roughly rounding things. It could have only been 2 years after the death of the first child that she fell pregnant. The husk fell pregnant again. And that's very, very, very quick. And I'm not saying it's unusual in terms of, she's not the only person that, you could point to and say that they've done that quickly. I'm not saying it's unusual. I just think it's quick. I think the grieving process, and again, this will come out as the story unfolds. I think the grieving process, obviously it's different for everybody, but I just think that's very, very quick. And has she really grieved the loss of that child? Or is she trying to replace it? So along comes the beacon. And then within 2 years, she's brought the second child. Well, it's the third really, but the second one. In terms of there's two children in this story who are alive. So the second one comes along 2 years after the beacon. Again, very quick, in my opinion. Well, that was the norm back then. It probably still is today. Get one out, get the next one out, and then we'll move on, and they can grow up together at a similar age. So she goes through that first trauma, has 2 children, then her husband leaves her for another woman, at which point she has told the story on many occasions that, to us that is, that when the Beacon's natural dad was still in the family, in the household, for those 6 years, or however long they were married. Obviously they were married before they had the Beacon. And the Huskers told me several times the story about how amazing family life was, and how happy she was with her first husband, and the fact that they had the best house in the street. Now this is important. These bits are important. She would often say how they had the words to the effect of they had the best house in the street. They lived on a kind of newish 1970s housing estate, which at the time would have been pretty brand new. And they had the best house on the block, on the street. Her husband, the father, could play the piano or the organ. So they used to invite their friends round. The other couples in the street used to all come round theirs, and he would play the organ, and they'd all sing songs and drink and be merry, and who knows, possibly put their keys in the bowl. Obviously, I've completely made that up for effect. But they were the kind of the keeping up, in terms of keeping up with the Joneses. They didn't have to do it. They were the Joneses. That's what I take from that, and it's very interesting. Again, these insights into the Husk become very interesting as the story unfolds. So she was devastated when he left her. But she has admitted over time that she maybe paid too much attention to her girls, and maybe not enough attention to him, or certainly to their relationship. Their relationship was second to the girls. Now, obviously, everybody should be equal, but everybody's got different needs, but they should be met with the same level of importance. As long as, obviously, you can't expect to have a relationship when exactly the same relationship in terms of a social life when kids come along. But in terms of your basic needs as a husband or a wife, they can be met easily when there's kids in the house. Easily. It just takes more work. So yeah, she admits that maybe she didn't give her relationship enough attention, and all of her attention was on the kids. Again, I have to say, I've only got her word for that. So she went through, he walked out, and something that she has said a number of times over the years was that she even begged him to stay, and begged him to the point of, I'm literally imagining her on her knees, and even if he just stayed until, her words, even if he just stayed until they were 18, she describes her inner feelings of doing that as completely shameful. Guilt and shame, embarrassment, lowering herself to that begging, which is absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. I mean, the reasons for wanting your husband or wife to stay might be that for the kids, for stability, but I'm not sure that an unloving and unharmonious relationship is any better for kids than a divorce. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to guess that it's no better, because what they might see is, arguments, or even just subtle little things. Kids are much more perceptive than what a lot of people of this generation, I'm talking about generation baby boomers, they're a lot more perceptive than what the people think. I think we're more aware of this now, how perceptive kids are, but not in those days. So anyway, I'm pretty sure that an unloving, uncaring and unharmonious relationship wouldn't have been the best thing. The kids would have picked up on it, and it could have potentially done more damage, because it could have normalised an unloving relationship, and you didn't want your kids to see that. You want your kids to see a normal, fulfilled, loving relationship. So anyway, she begged. She admits that she's ashamed of herself, and she admits that was the lowest thing she could have ever done. And again, her words, and then he said no, and then I felt even worse, which rightly so, you should. I don't mean that nastily. What I mean is, yeah, that's the correct way to feel. You should be ashamed of yourself, and then you should be even more ashamed of yourself when he says no, because you've realised that you've gone through that shame for nothing. Nobody should put themselves through that. Nobody. And I'm not sure if she begged him. Obviously, there'd be two levels to this, or two sides to this. One, did she beg him just for the good of the children, just for their well-being? Or did she beg him because they were the Joneses, and because she didn't want to lose face, lose status? She didn't want to have to deal with the guilt and the shame of having to put a for sale sign up, and the gossip around the street saying, you'll never guess what, the Joneses have split up and he's run away with another woman, and all of the gossip that goes along with that. What was more important to her, saving face, or her girls, her girls' upbringing? So at this stage, your guess is as good as mine. At the time I knew that, before I got more information in the last 3 years, your guess is the same as what my guess was. And when your family are telling you these stories, which are pretty hard to hear, you've got empathy and sympathy. You want to believe. You want to believe what feels nice. We're all susceptible to that when it comes to our families and our loved ones. You want to believe what feels nice, and what felt nice at the time was believing that she'd put herself second for the good of her daughters, because that's what you want to believe. And that why would I believe anything else at the time? And the Beacon has also told me that what that included was, still have the relationship with the other woman, but please stay in the house with me and the children. So she wasn't begging him to come back and rebuild whatever was broken. No, you can still have the other woman. So yeah, I forgot about that bit. So now that you know that, what sort of a person, what sort of a woman does that to herself? And what message is that sending the kids? That could get brought up at any point in an argument in the future. I just think this relationship is going to go, well, what planet are you on? But for a long time I didn't know that. I didn't realise that. It wasn't until I don't know, maybe 5 years or so ago, I learned about the fact that she was willing to sleep in the same bed as a man that was having an affair, and happily have the kids in that environment. So it's bizarre. I really do wonder what the motivation was for that. So then anyway, she becomes a single parent, which is obviously hard. 2 girls at home. She has to be both the earner, put the bread on the table, put the roof over the head, the protector, and the nurturer, the carer. She has to be the father figure and the mother figure. And it would seem that she kind of hardened in that role. She had to be seen as tough because she had been let down. She'd gone through a few difficult things in her life, and she sort of becomes hardened to her environment, very guarded, doesn't show any vulnerability, doesn't show much emotion. I always thought it is. I always thought, and it is, a tool to protect her from dangers, i.e. dangers such as being hugely let down by your nearest and dearest, like your husband walking out on you, and then having to stand on your own 2 feet at this stage and look after 2 girls and blah blah blah. So she became very hardened and guarded. It comes across as strong, like I think she thinks she's a strong person, but it's not. It's just a husk. It's just a protection, a shield. And then she meets her new husband, which clearly is a marriage of convenience. That's all I'm going to say at this stage. And again, I think there's a lot of resentment as a result of that, a lot of bitterness, and chip on her shoulder that her life hasn't turned out the way that she wanted. But as the story goes on, you'll find out that your life turns out exactly the way it's meant to. Certainly when it comes to, when you've made decisions based on your own free will and how those decisions come back in from the universe with the consequences. Her life is exactly where it should be. But yeah, definitely got a chip on the shoulder, and quite envious as well. Quite an envious person. Now, when I first met the Husk, early years, I had what I thought was a really, really good relationship. I'm a very sociable person. Once I feel comfortable with somebody, I've kind of, because remember, I've constantly been let down. So once I sort of build up a bit of trust, then I'm very, very sociable, and I'm quite fun to be around. I mean, people laugh in my company, so I'm going to assume they'll laugh at things that I say. So I'm going to assume that I'm quite fun to be around. I could be extremely pessimistic, but I can also be fun. So we had a good relationship, the Husk and I. And as time went on, I was aware she was very controlling of the Beacon back in the early days. When the Beacon lived at home, she was kind of like, forced to go and see her grandparents every Saturday, because that's what the Beacon was brought up to believe. When you're forced to go and see your grandparents, that means you love and respect them. No, it doesn't. Again, baby boomers. And again, when I say baby boomers, please don't take it as a blanket statement. I just see this a lot in that generation. Forced to go and see her grandparents. She was basically, the Husk was quite controlling. And I came along and I was like, why do you have to go and see your grandparents? And eventually she kind of rebelled slightly against the authority of her mother and the rules-based system of a family. But I didn't think too much of it. I was still just a teenager. I just saw it as like ridiculous, being forced to go to your grandparents when you're 16, 17. Don't get it. If it's so important that grandparents see their grandchildren, get in your car or get on the bus. Kids have got a life to live. It's not long before they're, working, having to pay tax and try and get on the property ladder and all of the other things that go along with being an adult. When they're a kid, when they're still young, let them enjoy their life and their freedom. Don't drag them, force them to go and see their grandparents who've had their life. They've had their life. Kids don't owe you anything. They don't owe their parents anything. Certainly don't owe their grandparents anything. It's the other way around. Parents owe their children everything. They brought them into this world. They bring them nothing but joy. And if they've brought them up the right way, they'll continue to bring them nothing but joy. Parents owe children everything. Putting a roof over their head and giving them necessities like food, clothing, and nurturing them and helping them grow and thrive is your basic responsibility as a parent. So they don't owe you anything. So anyway, as time went on, my relationship as a young man was good. My relationship with the Husk was good. A bit of banter, and no complaints. But as this story goes on, I think you'll see that obviously it's more complex than that as the story goes on. I'll just let the story evolve rather than try and jump about. So relationship was good. No complaints. Early days when the beacon still lived at home. Just something else to say about the husk. Her childhood, she was brought up by obviously her parents, but the generation above the baby boomers is, I think, called the silent generation. You don't speak until you're spoken to. Little boys are seen and never heard. And certainly her dad, the husk's dad, was definitely a very, very, very silent man. Her mother was a gobby one. But the silent generation, I believe, were very, very, very authoritarian. And they wouldn't have nurtured children carefully through their early development. They would have just been very strict, authoritarian, had rules, and children being brought up by that generation would have been forced to just get on with it. Keep your mouth shut and get on with it. And don't speak until you're spoken to. None of the feelings validated, none of their emotions validated, and generally would have been left feeling unimportant, low self-esteem, unworthy. So that's what the husk, her parents were that silent generation. But her mother was very gobby, the husk's mother, very opinionated, very much like the husk. Very, 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 very similar, almost identical, I would say. And this story that the husk has told us several occasions is when she was a young girl, probably early teens maybe, and she went to the hairdressers and she dared to go to the hairdressers by herself and get a haircut of her choice. Now bear in mind, this would have been the 60s when the husk was going through the teens, the early teens. This is when society was going through a transformation of sex and drugs and rock and roll. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones and miniskirts. So this was, I'm going to imagine the husk dabbling in something a bit more provocative in terms of a hairstyle. So anyway, she got this haircut and she returned home, and her mother went absolutely ballistic. And she literally, these are her words, she literally says that she dragged her back to the hairdressers, dragged her into the hairdressers, shouting and bawling in front of all of the staff, in front of all of the customers in the shop, and insisted that she puts her hair back to the way it was. So, obviously there's just one example, but imagine what that has done. Imagine the amount of shame and guilt that's been forced upon that completely innocent young girl, completely innocent. And again, this is what that older generation were. They were more bothered about how their children looked in terms of how it made the family look. What will people think if she goes out with a haircut like that? What will people think if she goes out dressed like that? And I'm all for being a bit more conservative when it comes to my daughter dressing, if that's the right phrase. But I would never treat her like that, ever, ever, ever. I just, it would break my heart to watch your daughter when she's upset. And me and my daughter, in 14 years, I think I've raised my voice twice, and I think that's good. And I've never had to. It's not because I'm of the quiet generation. It's because I've never needed to raise my voice more than twice. So, but obviously I've seen my daughter upset for other reasons, nothing to do with the family, external reasons, school, other relationships, whatever. I've seen her upset. Obviously I've seen her upset on those 2 occasions when I raised my voice. It absolutely breaks my heart to see her upset. So there is no way I could maintain a level of anger to the degree that I'm dragging her back to the hairdressers. I'm still angry enough to drag her in and shout and bawl, and that whole situation to pan out. In my book, that's an extreme amount of anger. Just because you got a haircut, just because you might bring guilt and shame to her mother. I'm ashamed of you. Now, what's that doing to that young girl? That's my point. And that's one story, but that's how she was brought up. Well, it's not being brought up, but that's to me the early stages of the husk being built. That's what that is to me. So a bit more background there on the husk. And I suppose there's one more character to mention, and that's the Beacon's sister, who I'm going to refer to as Roadkill, and that's not meant to be a derogatory term. I think she's been completely steamrolled by the husk. I think I really do feel for her. Mainly because she's got no idea about what I know and what the Beacon knows, and she's got no perception of the problems that's going on in this family. She's unaware, and she's got no idea that the husk is potentially a sociopath, and all of the other things that you have to get your head around, if that's true, i.e. she doesn't feel love, she doesn't love you. So the name Roadkill is just meant to be exactly that. She's been completely flattened and she's completely unaware. And so for all I feel sympathy, I also feel a little bit of frustration, because allegedly, I'm saying allegedly, Roadkill is a mental health professional. On what level, I don't know, I'm not sure. Haven't spoken to her enough about her profession. I think she's actually just a manager now, so she's not even practicing. But for some period of time, so she's a manager within the mental health profession, but for some period of time, she had a certain level of training because she had to deal with mentally ill patients. So she would have had a level of training, qualifications, I don't know what level, but she was dealing with mentally ill patients. So you would think that somebody with a background in mental health would be able to identify when somebody's mentally ill. But obviously, this is her mother at the end of the day. Maybe when you're that close, you can't see it. Maybe you don't want to see it. So the husk the husk is the younger sister, so again, dealt with the same things that the beacon dealt with in terms of a dad leaving. She was 4 though, so she hadn't had those sort of first important 7 years of stability. So she had a different experience to the beacon in terms of she went through a trauma at the age of 4. And so she was only halfway there in terms of the 7 years, just over halfway there in terms of the 7 most important years of development. The years that give you initial programming and effectively make you into, generally speaking, effectively make you into the person that you are today. And when the stepdad came along, and the petty arguments would happen, whereas the beacon would stand up to him as if to say, who do you think you're talking to? I'll do what I want. It's my house. Or however that went down. When the beacon stood up to him, the roadkill would just, go and hide. If the stepdad came in, and if there was potential for an argument, like the dishes hadn't been done, or the telephone, somebody was on the telephone too long, the beacon would roadkill would sense the argument and just go up in our bedroom. This is what the beacon tells us. And so it's just like running away, isn't it? You can't deal with the confrontation, and that has, she is that person today. Doesn't self-admittant, doesn't like confrontation, and is, her words, a conformist. Goes along to get along, a peacekeeper. Let's just sweep it under the carpet and move on. Let's not talk about it. It's too confrontational. Let's just all keep our mouth shut and move on. Keep the peace. That's, in my book, that's always going to lead to a disaster, because you can't keep everybody happy by sweeping it under the carpet. Nobody's happy sweeping it under the carpet, if truth be told. What you should do when there's a disagreement in a family, you should sit round the table, let everybody have their say, and then come to a sensible compromise that everybody's can live with, that everybody's happy to live with. And that's how you do it, and you can only do that by letting everybody have their say and let everybody get it off the chest, what they need to, and how they feel about things. So roadkill is the complete opposite to that. Roadkill, like the husk, just doesn't deal with anything head on. Will just keep their mouth shut to keep the peace. Doesn't like confrontation, and will actually run in the opposite direction if they sense it. And this has been shown in our adult life as well. Like I say, they're her words. She's a conformist. But there's been things which have happened in recent adult life which confirm that as well. Things such as the beacon fell out with her natural dad on a moral issue. Very, 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 very important moral issue. So again, you can see the beacon's characteristics coming out. You might be my natural dad, but I'm not giving up on a moral issue. I'm not going along with sweeping it under the carpet. You either apologise, take responsibility, apologise, and we'll move on at that point, or see you later. That's, that is strength when you put morals above all else. So that little story there about the beacon, her sister was present when this incident happened, what caused the upset happened. The roadkill was there, and she basically just buried her head in the sand and just pretended it wasn't happening right in front of her face. I don't need to give any more detail than that. Just take my word for it. That's how she dealt with it. She just kind of like pretended it wasn't happening. And whereas what she should have done was she should have stuck up for her sister, because she's since admitted that her sister was right. I mean, we know the beacon was right. We know that. We don't need anybody to tell us. But in the heat of the moment, sometimes you need an ally. And rather than being an ally, she just stuck her head in the sand. So these are behaviours, and this is as a 40-year-old, I'm trying to think how long ago this was, 40-year-old, a 40-year-old woman, and she can't stand up for her sister. And since the beacon, her and my relationship with the natural father has broke down, because he won't take responsibility and he won't apologise. And this is a huge thing that he needs to apologise for, or that he needed to apologise for. We've never had any communication. That's his choice. All he needed to do was apologise, and that's it. So, but the beacon, roadkill still has a relationship. I mean, it's not the best. It's totally fake, and you'll understand why, or you'll understand how when I tell you. Obviously, when she does see her natural father, roadkill, the beacon's name never gets mentioned. They just pretend that she doesn't exist. Bear in mind, got a 14-year-old daughter who hasn't seen her granddad for 7 years. And the pair of them, roadkill and, let's just call him the knob father, instead of the godfather, which he thinks he is, he's the knob father. Roadkill and the knob father just go along as if the beacon and the 14-year-old daughter don't exist. Never gets a mention. Never once has any of our names been mentioned between those two people. And quite frankly, I think that's disgusting. I think that as a sister, she should be challenging him, saying, yeah, at least putting her name into the conversation to make him feel guilty and to force him to acknowledge that he's done nothing to repair this. I think that's her moral duty as our sister. So you can see that this family doesn't function like a strong family where everybody's got each other's back. It's a completely dysfunctional family where people just sweep things under the carpet and pretend that they haven't happened. And myself and the beacon, we can't live in conditions like that. We just can't. So I don't like, why is roadkill like that? I don't know. I think she's potentially just never been able to face confrontation, because maybe she's had to deal with it at too young an age. You know, if you see confrontation between our stepdad and our sibling, or our stepdad and our mum, if you see confrontation at too early an age, how the hell do you deal with that? It's just awful. It is awful. I don't like confrontation. I hate seeing people argue. That's normal, but you can deal with it. And I'm not scared of confrontation. I don't enjoy it, being part of it, but I'm not scared of it if it's the right thing to do. I just put that fear, I just drive through that fear and anxiety, and I just do it. So that's my best guess. She's never learned how to deal with confrontation and she's just going off what she's learned behaviour, just run away from it. I've seen this in other areas as well, which I don't need to go into, but believe me, confrontation makes her very, 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 very anxious. And maybe most kids have been brought up in those situations where maybe parents have not had the best of relationships, maybe argued and bickered in front of their kids, and maybe that's what happens in those situations. So I think that's enough for the first episode, the first entry into the diary. Background on all of the characters, myself, the beacon, the most important character in the story, the beacon, the husk, and roadkill, the natural dad or the knob father, and the stepdad.